Question 1. Quality control measures reveal a significant operational disruption impacting the processing of client transactions. The internal audit team has flagged this as a potential risk event. What is the most appropriate initial step for the compliance officer to take in assessing and managing this situation? Option A. Advise all client-facing staff to refrain from discussing the operational issue with clients until a definitive solution is found, regardless of client inquiries. Option B. Initiate a formal risk assessment process to identify, analyze, and evaluate the potential impact and likelihood of the operational disruption, and develop appropriate mitigation and reporting strategies. Option C. Proceed with reporting the incident to the relevant regulatory body based on the initial alert from internal audit, without further investigation into the scope or impact. Option D. Immediately issue a public statement acknowledging the disruption and providing an estimated timeline for resolution, based on initial informal reports from the operations department. Correct answer is B. Initiate a formal risk assessment process to identify, analyze, and evaluate the potential impact and likelihood of the operational disruption, and develop appropriate mitigation and reporting strategies. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for timely information with the imperative to maintain data integrity and adhere to regulatory reporting standards. The pressure to provide immediate updates can lead to shortcuts that compromise accuracy, potentially resulting in regulatory breaches and loss of stakeholder trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any communication is both informative and compliant. The correct approach involves a structured and validated risk assessment process. This means identifying potential risks associated with the identified operational issue, evaluating their likelihood and impact, and then developing mitigation strategies. This systematic process ensures that decisions are based on a thorough understanding of the potential consequences, and that any reporting or action taken is proportionate and compliant with the Akademie Sting internal policies and any relevant external regulatory guidelines for financial institutions. This approach prioritizes accuracy and compliance, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory obligations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately disseminate preliminary or unverified information. This fails to acknowledge the risk of misinformation and the potential for regulatory scrutiny if the initial information proves inaccurate. It bypasses the essential step of risk assessment, which is designed to prevent such errors. Another incorrect approach is to delay any communication until absolute certainty is achieved, even if the delay is excessive. While accuracy is paramount, an unreasonable delay in informing relevant parties about a significant operational issue can itself constitute a failure, potentially violating disclosure requirements or creating operational risks due to lack of awareness. This approach neglects the need for timely, albeit carefully qualified, communication. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or informal discussions to gauge the severity of the issue and decide on a course of action. This lacks the rigor required for a professional risk assessment and can lead to decisions based on incomplete or biased information, increasing the likelihood of regulatory noncompliance and operational missteps. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the issue, followed by a comprehensive risk assessment. This assessment should involve gathering all available data, consulting with relevant experts, and evaluating potential impacts. Based on this assessment, a communication strategy should be developed that is both timely and accurate, adhering to all applicable regulatory requirements and internal policies. This iterative process ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound. Question 2. The control framework reveals that the Akademie Sting entrance exam must assess a candidate's understanding of proactive risk management within an academic institution. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates a candidate's grasp of a fundamental risk assessment process relevant to university operations? Option A. Listing all possible negative outcomes for the university without prioritizing them. Option B. Relying on personal intuition to predict future challenges for the admissions department. Option C. Suggesting immediate improvements to campus security based on a recent minor incident. Option D. Identifying potential disruptions to the student onboarding process and outlining steps to mitigate their impact. The correct answer is D. Identifying potential disruptions to the student onboarding process and outlining steps to mitigate their impact. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practical constraints of a university entrance exam. The Akademie Sting entrance exam, as a regulatory framework for admissions, mandates a thorough evaluation of candidates' potential to succeed in their chosen field. A key component of this is assessing their understanding of risk assessment principles, which are fundamental to many academic and professional disciplines. The challenge lies in creating a question that probes this understanding conceptually, without resorting to complex calculations, while remaining strictly within the scope of the exam's defined regulatory environment. The correct approach involves identifying a situation where a candidate must apply a systematic process to evaluate potential threats and opportunities related to a specific academic or administrative function within the university context. This aligns with the core principles of risk assessment, which require identifying risks, analyzing their likelihood and impact, and determining appropriate responses. The regulatory framework for the Akademie Sting entrance exam implicitly requires candidates to demonstrate an understanding of how to proactively manage uncertainties that could affect the institution's objectives, such as the integrity of its admissions process or the successful integration of new students. This approach is correct because it tests the candidate's ability to think critically about potential issues and their mitigation, a skill essential for academic rigor and adherence to institutional guidelines. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on identifying a single, isolated risk without considering its broader implications or the systematic process of assessment. For instance, merely listing potential problems without a framework for evaluation fails to demonstrate an understanding of risk assessment methodology. Another incorrect approach would be to propose solutions without first understanding the nature and magnitude of the risks involved, which is contrary to the sequential and analytical nature of risk assessment. Furthermore, an approach that relies on subjective judgment without any structured analysis or consideration of evidence would also be flawed, as it would not meet the objective standards expected in a formal assessment process governed by the exam's regulatory framework. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific objectives being assessed. Then, they should identify potential risks that could impede the achievement of those objectives. This involves brainstorming, consulting relevant documentation, and considering past experiences. Following identification, a systematic analysis of the likelihood and potential impact of each risk is crucial. Finally, appropriate control measures or responses should be developed and implemented, with a plan for ongoing monitoring and review. This structured decision-making process ensures that risk assessment is comprehensive, objective, and effective, aligning with the principles embedded within the Akademie Sting entrance exam's regulatory mandate. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a robust approach to risk assessment to ensure the integrity and effectiveness of the Akademie Sting entrance exam. Which of the following best describes the most appropriate risk assessment methodology for this context? Option A. A focus on the immediate logistical challenges of exam administration, such as printing quantities and venue booking, as these are the most tangible risks. Option B. A review of past exam performance data to identify recurring issues, without considering potential new threats or evolving candidate demographics. Option C. An assessment limited to risks that are easily quantifiable and have a high probability of occurring, ignoring less obvious or qualitative risks. Option D. A comprehensive process that identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks across all aspects of the exam, from question development to candidate evaluation, and develops mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. A comprehensive process that identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks across all aspects of the exam, from question development to candidate evaluation, and develops mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for proactive risk identification with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the potential for overanalysis. Thorough risk assessment is fundamental to sound strategic planning, ensuring that potential threats and opportunities are understood and addressed. The Akademie Sting entrance exam, by its nature, necessitates a rigorous approach to evaluating candidates, and this extends to the strategic planning of its admissions process. The correct approach involves a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of potential risks that could impact the integrity and effectiveness of the entrance exam. This includes identifying risks related to question design, administration, candidate assessment, and the overall fairness of the process. By categorizing these risks and assessing their likelihood and potential impact, the Akademie can develop appropriate mitigation strategies. This aligns with the principles of good governance and operational excellence expected of an academic institution, ensuring that the entrance exam serves its purpose of selecting suitable candidates without compromising quality or fairness. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate operational issues, such as the number of exam papers to print, fails to address the broader strategic risks. This oversight could lead to more significant problems down the line, such as a flawed assessment methodology or reputational damage, which are not captured by a narrow operational focus. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the most obvious and easily quantifiable risks, while neglecting less apparent but potentially more damaging threats, demonstrates a lack of foresight. Strategic risk assessment requires looking beyond the immediate and considering a wider spectrum of possibilities, including those that may be harder to measure but could have a profound impact on the exam's credibility. Finally, an approach that relies on historical data without considering current trends or future uncertainties is also flawed. The landscape of education and candidate profiles can change, and a static risk assessment may not adequately prepare the Akademie for emerging challenges. Effective strategic planning requires adaptability and a forward-looking perspective. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with defining the scope of the risk assessment. This involves identifying all relevant stakeholders and potential risk categories. Next, a systematic process of risk identification, analysis, likelihood, and impact, and evaluation should be undertaken. Finally, risk treatment strategies should be developed and implemented, with ongoing monitoring and review. This iterative process ensures that the risk assessment remains relevant and effective. Question 4. The audit findings indicate a potential weakness in the operational risk management framework of the client's IT department. To assess the effectiveness of their risk mitigation strategies, what is the most appropriate approach for the auditor to gather necessary information? Option A. Request a summary of the key risk mitigation strategies implemented by the department, supported by high-level documentation demonstrating their application. Option B. Seek access to the department's strategic planning documents and all associated risk registers without a clear link to the specific audit scope. Option C. Demand access to all internal risk assessment reports, including raw data, detailed methodologies, and supporting documentation for every identified risk. Option D. Ask for a detailed breakdown of every identified risk, regardless of its materiality or potential impact on the department's operations. The correct answer is A. Request a summary of the key risk mitigation strategies implemented by the department, supported by high-level documentation demonstrating their application. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the ethical and regulatory obligations to protect client confidentiality and ensure data integrity. The auditor must exercise sound judgment to determine the appropriate level of detail to request without compromising sensitive information or exceeding the scope of the audit. The correct approach involves requesting a summary of the key risk mitigation strategies implemented by the department, supported by high-level documentation. This is the most appropriate because it directly addresses the audit's objective of assessing risk management effectiveness, without demanding access to proprietary or overly granular data. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial institutions or data protection, typically mandate that auditors focus on material risks and the controls designed to mitigate them. Requesting summaries and high-level documentation aligns with the principle of proportionality, ensuring that the audit process is efficient and does not impose undue burdens on the audited entity while still obtaining sufficient evidence. This approach respects client confidentiality by not requiring the disclosure of sensitive operational details unless absolutely necessary and directly relevant to an identified risk. Requesting all internal risk assessment reports, including raw data and detailed methodologies, is an incorrect approach. This would likely violate confidentiality agreements and data protection regulations by demanding access to highly sensitive and potentially proprietary information that may not be directly relevant to the audit's specific objectives. It also risks overwhelming the audit team with excessive data, hindering efficient analysis. Asking for a detailed breakdown of every identified risk regardless of its materiality or impact, is also an incorrect approach. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment in scoping the request and could lead to the unnecessary disclosure of minor or irrelevant information, potentially straining the relationship with the audited department and violating principles of efficiency and proportionality in auditing. Demanding access to the department's strategic planning documents and all associated risk registers without a clear link to the audit scope is an incorrect approach. This overreaches the audit's mandate and could infringe upon the department's autonomy and confidentiality of its strategic decision-making processes. It fails to demonstrate a focused and relevant information-gathering strategy. Professionals should approach such situations by first clearly defining the audit's objectives and the specific information needed to achieve them. They should then consider the regulatory and ethical implications of their information requests, prioritizing data that is relevant, material, and obtainable without breaching confidentiality or imposing unreasonable burdens. A collaborative approach, seeking to understand the audited entity's constraints and offering alternative, less intrusive methods of evidence gathering, is crucial for maintaining professional relationships and ensuring effective audits. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that the Akademie sting is seeking to enhance its admissions process by evaluating candidates' foundational understanding of risk assessment principles. A hypothetical scenario is presented to applicants involving a new student club planning an outdoor event. Which of the following approaches best reflects a systematic risk assessment for this scenario? Option A. Listing all potential problems that could occur during the event, such as bad weather or low attendance. Option B. Immediately brainstorming solutions to prevent any possible issue from happening, regardless of its likelihood. Option C. Identifying potential risks, assessing their likelihood and potential impact, and then considering appropriate responses. Option D. Relying on past experiences of similar events to predict what might go wrong without formal analysis. The correct answer is A. Listing all potential problems that could occur during the event, such as bad weather or low attendance. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practical constraints of an entrance exam. The Akademie Sting entrance exam, as a gatekeeper for future professionals, must ensure that candidates possess a foundational understanding of risk assessment principles without demanding the depth of experience a seasoned professional would have. The challenge lies in designing a question that probes conceptual understanding and the ability to apply basic risk assessment frameworks within a simulated, albeit simplified, academic context. The correct approach involves identifying the most comprehensive and systematic method for evaluating potential risks in a given scenario, aligning with the foundational principles of risk management as likely taught or expected within the Akademie's curriculum. This approach prioritizes a structured process that considers both the likelihood and impact of identified risks, leading to informed decision-making. Specifically, it would involve a methodical identification of potential risks, an assessment of their potential impact and likelihood, and the consideration of appropriate mitigation strategies, even if at a conceptual level. This aligns with the core tenets of risk assessment expected in any professional setting, adapted for an academic evaluation. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on identifying risks without considering their potential impact or likelihood. This is a superficial understanding of risk assessment, as it fails to prioritize which risks require the most attention. Another incorrect approach would be to propose solutions without first understanding the risks involved. This demonstrates a lack of systematic thinking and a tendency towards reactive rather than proactive management. Finally, an approach that relies on intuition or anecdotal evidence without a structured framework is also professionally unacceptable, as it lacks objectivity and is prone to bias, failing to meet the standards of a rigorous risk assessment process. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the objective of the assessment. In an academic context like an entrance exam, the goal is to gauge understanding of fundamental principles. The decision-making process should involve breaking down the problem into its core components, identifying the key elements of a sound risk assessment, identification, analysis, evaluation, and then selecting the option that best reflects a systematic and comprehensive application of these elements, even in a simplified scenario. This involves critically evaluating each option against the established principles of risk management. Question 6. Benchmark analysis indicates that the Akademie Sting entrance exam faces potential threats to its integrity. A risk assessment process is being initiated to safeguard the examination. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the Akademie Sting regulatory framework for ensuring a fair and secure entrance examination? Option A. Allocating the smallest possible budget to risk management activities to maximize resources for other operational aspects of the examination. Option B. Prioritizing the identification and assessment of risks related to question paper security, candidate verification, and the fairness of the examination environment, followed by the development of specific mitigation plans. Option C. Focusing primarily on ensuring sufficient invigilators are present and that all examination rooms are adequately equipped with necessary stationery. Option D. Relying on the informal recollections of past examination supervisors to anticipate potential issues and address them as they arise. Correct answer is B. Prioritizing the identification and assessment of risks related to question paper security, candidate verification, and the fairness of the examination environment, followed by the development of specific mitigation plans. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, all while adhering to the Akademie Sting-specific regulatory framework. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and prioritizing risks that are most likely to impact the integrity and fairness of the entrance examination process, as stipulated by Akademie Sting guidelines. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying potential risks to the examination's integrity, assessing their likelihood and impact, and then developing mitigation strategies. This aligns with the Akademie Sting emphasis on robust governance and fair assessment practices. Specifically, Akademie Sting regulations mandate a proactive approach to risk management, requiring institutions to anticipate and address potential vulnerabilities that could compromise the validity of their entrance examinations. This includes risks related to question security, candidate impersonation, and the fairness of the assessment environment. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate logistical issues, such as ensuring sufficient seating or adequate invigilator numbers, fails to address the fundamental risks to the examination's integrity. While important, these are operational concerns rather than core risks to the assessment's validity. This approach would violate Akademie Sting guidelines by neglecting the systematic identification and mitigation of threats to the examination's fairness and credibility. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past experiences without a structured framework for risk identification and assessment is also professionally unacceptable. Akademie Sting requires a data-driven and documented approach to risk management, not one based on assumptions or informal observations. This would lead to a failure to identify and address critical risks, potentially undermining the entire examination process and violating the principle of due diligence expected by the Akademie. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost-saving measures over thorough risk mitigation would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Akademie Sting regulations prioritize the integrity and fairness of the examination above all else. Cutting corners on risk assessment or mitigation to save money would directly contravene these principles and could lead to severe reputational damage and a loss of trust in the Akademie's assessment processes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements of the Akademie Sting. This involves consulting relevant guidelines and policies. Next, they should engage in a structured risk identification process involving relevant stakeholders. This should be followed by a qualitative or semi-quantitative assessment of identified risks, considering both likelihood and impact. Finally, appropriate mitigation strategies should be developed, documented, and implemented with a plan for ongoing monitoring and review. Question 7. The audit findings indicate that the current risk assessment process for new program development at Akademie Sting may not adequately identify potential academic integrity vulnerabilities. Which of the following approaches best addresses this finding in accordance with the Akademie Sting regulatory framework for academic governance and risk management? Option A. Temporarily suspend the introduction of new programs until a complete overhaul of the risk assessment process can be completed, potentially impacting strategic growth initiatives. Option B. Delegate the responsibility for identifying academic integrity risks solely to the newly appointed academic integrity officer without providing them with additional resources or a revised assessment framework. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the existing risk assessment framework for new program development, incorporating feedback from faculty and academic administrators to identify specific gaps and enhance the methodology for identifying and mitigating academic integrity risks. Option D. Implement a mandatory, one-time training session for all faculty involved in program development on general risk management principles, assuming this will address the identified vulnerabilities. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the existing risk assessment framework for new program development, incorporating feedback from faculty and academic administrators to identify specific gaps and enhance the methodology for identifying and mitigating academic integrity risks. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for operational efficiency with the long-term imperative of maintaining robust risk management practices, as mandated by the Akademie Sting entrance exam's regulatory framework. The audit findings highlight a potential gap in the current risk assessment process, necessitating a thoughtful and compliant response. The correct approach involves a systematic review and enhancement of the existing risk assessment methodology. This aligns with the Akademie Sting emphasis on proactive risk identification and mitigation, ensuring that all potential threats to academic integrity and operational continuity are adequately addressed. Regulatory compliance dictates that risk assessments are not static but dynamic, evolving with the institution's activities and the external environment. A thorough review ensures that the assessment accurately reflects current risks and that mitigation strategies are effective and appropriately resourced. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings as minor or to implement superficial changes without a comprehensive understanding of the underlying issues. This could lead to a failure to identify and manage significant risks, potentially exposing the institution to academic misconduct, reputational damage, or operational disruptions. Such a response would contravene the Akademie Sting commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to best practices in risk management. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on immediate operational pressures without considering the systemic implications of the identified risk gaps. This short-sightedness neglects the foundational principles of sound governance and risk oversight, which are critical for the long-term sustainability and integrity of the institution. Professionals should approach such situations by first acknowledging the audit findings and their potential implications. They should then engage in a structured process of root cause analysis to understand why the risk assessment process may have fallen short. This involves consulting relevant internal policies, external regulatory guidance specific to educational institutions, and best practices in risk management. The decision-making process should prioritize actions that demonstrably strengthen the risk assessment framework, ensuring it is comprehensive, proportionate, and aligned with the Akademie Sting strategic objectives and regulatory obligations. Collaboration with relevant stakeholders, including academic staff, administrative departments, and potentially external advisors, is crucial to developing effective and sustainable solutions. Question 8. The audit findings indicate potential weaknesses in the financial reporting controls and a possible misallocation of research grant funds. Which of the following approaches best addresses these findings from a risk assessment perspective? Option A. Classify the findings as low priority due to the complexity of grant management and focus resources on other audit areas. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of the audit findings to identify specific control gaps and potential causes. Assess the likelihood and impact of each identified risk, and develop targeted mitigation plans based on a formal risk assessment framework. Option C. Immediately suspend all research grant disbursements and initiate disciplinary proceedings against the Finance Department pending a full external investigation. Option D. Issue a general memo to all staff reminding them of financial policies and procedures without investigating the specific findings further. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed review of the audit findings to identify specific control gaps and potential causes, assess the likelihood and impact of each identified risk, and develop targeted mitigation plans based on a formal risk assessment framework. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the audit findings, while identifying potential risks, are not definitive proof of misconduct. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough investigation and risk mitigation with the principles of fairness and due process. Acting prematurely without sufficient evidence could lead to reputational damage for individuals and the institution, while inaction could expose Akademie Sting to significant regulatory penalties or operational failures. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate level of response based on the severity and likelihood of the identified risks. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based risk assessment. This begins with a detailed review of the audit findings to understand the nature, scope, and potential impact of each identified risk. Following this, a comprehensive risk assessment framework, aligned with Akademie Sting internal policies and any applicable regulatory guidelines for educational institutions, should be employed. This framework would involve identifying potential control weaknesses, assessing the likelihood and impact of each risk materializing, and then prioritizing risks based on their potential severity. The outcome of this assessment would guide the development of proportionate and targeted mitigation strategies, which might include enhanced internal controls, further investigation, or policy revisions. This approach ensures that actions taken are justified, effective, and compliant with the institution's duty of care and regulatory obligations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement sweeping, punitive measures without a thorough assessment. This fails to acknowledge that audit findings are indicators, not conclusions, and could unfairly penalize individuals or departments. Such an approach disregards the principle of proportionality and could lead to a breakdown in trust and morale within the institution. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings as minor or inconsequential without proper evaluation. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to risk management best practices and could expose Akademie Sting to significant unforeseen consequences, potentially violating regulatory expectations for due diligence and oversight. A third incorrect approach might involve focusing solely on superficial remedies that do not address the root causes of the identified risks. This superficial response would be ineffective in mitigating actual threats and would likely be viewed as a failure to implement robust risk management by any relevant oversight body. Professionals should approach such situations by first establishing a clear understanding of the audit findings and their potential implications. They should then consult and apply the institution's established risk assessment policies and procedures. This involves a structured process of risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and treatment. Decision-making should be guided by evidence, regulatory requirements, and ethical consideration, ensuring that any actions taken are proportionate, justifiable, and aimed at achieving sustainable risk reduction. Question 9. The audit findings indicate a significant divergence between the firm's documented risk appetite statement and the actual risk-taking behavior observed across several key business units. This divergence appears to stem from a lack of consistent communication and integration of the risk appetite into day-to-day operational decision-making processes. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation? Option A. Classify the audit findings as minor procedural deviations and implement only superficial changes to reporting templates. Option B. Prioritize achieving the current quarter's business targets, deferring any remediation efforts related to risk appetite alignment until the next fiscal year. Option C. Immediately revise the risk appetite statement to better reflect the observed risk-taking behavior without further investigation into the underlying causes. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the risk appetite statement, its communication channels, and the integration of risk appetite considerations into operational controls and decision-making frameworks. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the risk appetite statement, its communication channels, and the integration of risk appetite considerations into operational controls and decision-making frameworks. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate operational pressures with the long-term integrity of risk management processes. The audit findings highlight a potential disconnect between documented risk appetite and actual risk-taking behavior, which can have significant implications for the firm's stability and regulatory standing. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any remediation efforts are effective and sustainable, rather than merely cosmetic. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the firm's risk appetite statement, its communication across the organization, and the alignment of operational controls and decision-making frameworks with this stated appetite. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the root cause of the audit findings by ensuring that the firm's stated tolerance for risk is understood, embedded in practice, and effectively monitored. This aligns with the principles of sound risk governance, which mandates that risk appetite be clearly defined, communicated, and operationalized. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial institutions, typically require firms to establish and maintain a robust risk management system that includes a clearly articulated risk appetite. Failure to do so can lead to uncontrolled risk-taking, potentially resulting in financial losses, reputational damage, and regulatory sanctions. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on updating the risk appetite statement without addressing its implementation and communication would be professionally unacceptable. This is because a statement, however well written, has no practical effect if it is not understood or adhered to by staff. This represents a failure in risk governance and operational control, potentially leading to continued misalignment between stated and actual risk-taking. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate business objectives over addressing the systemic risk management issue would also be professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for the audit findings and a failure to uphold the firm's responsibility to manage risk effectively. Such an approach prioritizes short-term gains at the expense of long-term stability and compliance, which is a clear ethical and regulatory failing. A further incorrect approach that involves dismissing the audit findings as minor operational oversights without a thorough investigation would be professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to take audit recommendations seriously. It risks perpetuating the underlying issues, potentially leading to more significant problems in the future. Professionals should approach such situations by first acknowledging the seriousness of the audit findings and their potential implications. They should then adopt a structured problem-solving approach, starting with a thorough root cause analysis. This involves understanding not just what happened, but why it happened. The next step is to develop a remediation plan that is comprehensive, actionable, and addresses the identified root causes. This plan should be communicated effectively to all relevant stakeholders, and its implementation should be monitored closely. Finally, a process for continuous improvement should be established to ensure that risk management practices remain robust and aligned with the firm's risk appetite. Question 10. Upon reviewing preliminary candidate data for the Akademie Sting entrance exam, a potential security vulnerability is identified that could expose personal information. What is the most appropriate initial step to manage this risk? Option A. Immediately escalate the issue to the IT security department and the admissions committee, documenting all findings and proposed mitigation steps. Option B. Delay addressing the vulnerability until after the entrance exam results are finalized to avoid disrupting the admissions process. Option C. Inform colleagues in the admissions office informally about the potential vulnerability to raise general awareness. Option D. Share the details of the vulnerability with external security consultants for immediate assessment without internal consultation. The correct answer is A. Immediately escalate the issue to the IT security department and the admissions committee, documenting all findings and proposed mitigation steps. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the ethical and regulatory obligations to protect sensitive data. The Akademie Sting entrance exam context implies a need for fairness and integrity in the admissions process, making the handling of candidate information paramount. Careful judgment is required to avoid both the premature disclosure of confidential material and the obstruction of legitimate internal review processes. The correct approach involves a structured and documented process of risk assessment that prioritizes data security and compliance with Akademie Sting internal policies and relevant data protection regulations. This approach ensures that any access to or use of candidate information is justified, proportionate, and recorded, thereby maintaining the integrity of the admissions process and safeguarding candidate privacy. It aligns with the ethical duty of care and the regulatory requirement to handle personal data responsibly. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, informal sharing of the identified risks without proper documentation or a clear escalation path fails to establish a robust audit trail and could lead to unauthorized access or misuse of sensitive information. This breaches the principle of data minimization and accountability. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the identified risks due to time constraints, represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a disregard for data protection obligations and could expose the Akademie to significant reputational damage and legal penalties. Furthermore, an approach that involves sharing the information with individuals not directly involved in the risk assessment or admissions decision-making process, even with good intentions, constitutes a breach of confidentiality and data privacy, violating the trust placed in the institution by the candidates. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the potential risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and then determining appropriate mitigation strategies. This process should be guided by institutional policies, ethical codes, and applicable regulations. Documentation at each stage is crucial for accountability and review. Question 11. The audit findings indicate that the risk assessment process for new academic program development at Akademie Sting may not be consistently applied, potentially leading to an underestimation of certain operational and reputational risks. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the documented risk assessment framework, including an evaluation of the data sources, methodologies, and control effectiveness, and compare this against the actual application observed in recent program developments. Option B. Accept the current risk assessment process as adequate, given the experience of the individuals responsible for its implementation, and focus on addressing any immediate financial implications identified by the audit. Option C. Prioritize a review of the financial projections associated with new programs to identify any discrepancies that might be indirectly linked to the risk assessment process. Option D. Initiate informal discussions with senior faculty members involved in program development to gather their perspectives on the perceived effectiveness of the current risk assessment process. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the documented risk assessment framework, including an evaluation of the data sources, methodologies, and control effectiveness, and compare this against the actual application observed in recent program developments. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for timely and accurate risk assessment with the potential for bias introduced by personal relationships or perceived pressure from senior management. The audit findings highlight a potential disconnect between the documented risk assessment process and its actual execution, suggesting a need for a robust and objective approach. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented review of the risk assessment methodology, including an evaluation of the data sources used, the assumptions made, and the controls in place to mitigate identified risks. This approach is justified by the Akademie Sting commitment to maintaining high standards of academic integrity and operational efficiency, as outlined in its internal governance policies. A thorough, objective review ensures that risk assessments are not only comprehensive, but also free from undue influence, thereby safeguarding the institution's reputation and resources. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or informal discussions with colleagues fails to adhere to the principles of due diligence and objective assessment. This approach risks overlooking critical risk factors or overemphasizing minor ones due to personal biases or incomplete information, which is a failure of professional responsibility and potentially a breach of internal audit guidelines. Another incorrect approach that involves accepting the existing risk assessment without further scrutiny, based on the assumption that it was conducted by experienced personnel, demonstrates a lack of critical thinking and a failure to challenge potentially flawed processes. This passive acceptance can perpetuate systemic weaknesses and expose the Akademie to unforeseen risks. A further incorrect approach that focuses on the immediate financial implications of the audit findings without addressing the underlying process issues is also professionally unsound. While financial impact is important, a true risk assessment must address the root causes of potential vulnerabilities, not just their symptoms. This approach neglects the fundamental requirement for a robust and repeatable risk management framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objectivity, thoroughness, and adherence to established procedures. This involves 1. Understanding the scope and objectives of the task. 2. Gathering relevant information from reliable sources. 3. Critically evaluating the information and identifying potential biases. 4. Consulting relevant policies and guidelines. And 5. documenting the process and conclusions clearly and comprehensively. In situations involving audit findings, it is crucial to approach the review with an open mind, a commitment to uncovering the truth, and a focus on improving the overall risk management framework. Question 12. The audit findings indicate a potential misallocation of research grant funds within the Department of Advanced Sciences, with preliminary evidence suggesting a pattern of unauthorized expenditures that could impact the Akademie financial standing and regulatory compliance. Option A. Immediately escalate the findings to the Akademie Chief Financial Officer and the Head of Compliance, providing a detailed report of the preliminary evidence and recommending a formal internal investigation. Option B. Directly approach the head of the Department of Advanced Sciences to discuss the audit findings and request an explanation for the observed discrepancies. Option C. Share the preliminary findings with a trusted colleague in another department to gather informal opinions on the potential implications. Option D. Document the findings but defer further action until the next scheduled audit cycle to avoid disrupting ongoing research activities. The correct answer is A. Immediately escalate the findings to the Akademie Chief Financial Officer and the Head of Compliance, providing a detailed report of the preliminary evidence and recommending a formal internal investigation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the ethical and regulatory obligations to protect client confidentiality and ensure data integrity. The auditor must exercise careful judgment to avoid compromising the investigation or violating established protocols. The correct approach involves a structured, documented process of escalating the findings through appropriate internal channels. This ensures that the discovery of potential irregularities is handled with the necessary oversight and adherence to the Akademie internal policies and any relevant external regulatory guidelines that govern audit procedures and data handling. This approach upholds the principles of professional skepticism and due diligence while respecting confidentiality and due process. An incorrect approach that involves directly confronting the department head without proper authorization or documentation risks prejudicing the investigation, potentially leading to the destruction or alteration of evidence. It also bypasses established reporting lines, which is a breach of internal governance and could have disciplinary consequences. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the findings due to their sensitive nature or the potential for disruption, constitutes a failure of professional duty. Auditors have an obligation to report material findings, and overlooking them would be a dereliction of this responsibility, potentially exposing the Akademie to significant risks. A further incorrect approach, like immediately reporting the findings to external authorities without first exhausting internal reporting mechanisms and allowing the Akademie to address the issues, could be premature and may violate confidentiality agreements or established procedures for handling internal audit matters. This could also damage the relationship between the Akademie and its auditors. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to established policies and procedures. This involves 1. Thoroughly documenting the findings. 2. Consulting internal audit manuals and relevant regulatory guidelines. 3. Escalating the findings through the designated reporting hierarchy, typically to the audit manager or a designated compliance officer. 4. Collaborating with relevant internal stakeholders to determine the appropriate course of action, ensuring all steps are recorded and justified. Question 13. Examination of the data shows a potential for significant disruption to the planned entrance exam administration due to an unforeseen technical issue with the primary examination platform. The administration team has a limited window to decide on a course of action to ensure the exam proceeds as scheduled. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of responsible risk management as expected for the Akademie entrance exam? Option A. Conduct a rapid, focused risk assessment of the primary platform's issue and the proposed alternative solutions, documenting key risks and mitigation strategies for a swift, informed decision. Option B. Proceed with the primary platform, assuming the technical issue is minor and will resolve itself, without any formal risk assessment or contingency planning. Option C. Halt the examination entirely and reschedule for an indefinite future date, to allow for a complete, in-depth risk assessment of all possible scenarios. Option D. Immediately switch to a secondary, less tested platform without a full evaluation of its own potential risks, prioritizing speed to maintain the schedule. The correct answer is D. Immediately switch to a secondary, less tested platform without a full evaluation of its own potential risks, prioritizing speed to maintain the schedule. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and available information, all while adhering to the Akademie Sting entrance exam's specific regulatory framework. The pressure to make a timely decision without compromising the integrity of the risk assessment process is a common dilemma. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying potential risks, analyzing their likelihood and impact, and developing appropriate mitigation strategies. This aligns with the Akademie Sting entrance exam's emphasis on a structured and evidence-based approach to decision-making, ensuring that all significant factors are considered before a conclusion is reached. Regulatory compliance dictates that risk assessments must be comprehensive enough to inform sound judgment, and this approach ensures that. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness would fail to identify all relevant risks, potentially leading to an underestimation of threats and inadequate preparedness. This is a direct violation of the principle of due diligence expected in any assessment process governed by academic or professional standards. Another incorrect approach, which relies solely on intuition or past experience without a formal assessment framework, lacks the objectivity and documentation required by regulatory guidelines. This can lead to biased conclusions and an inability to justify the decision-making process if challenged. Furthermore, an approach that ignores potential negative impacts, focusing only on positive outcomes, is ethically unsound and fails to meet the comprehensive nature of a risk assessment, which must consider all facets of a situation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope of the assessment, followed by systematic data gathering and analysis. This should include brainstorming potential risks, evaluating their probability and severity, and then developing a response plan. The process should be iterative, allowing for adjustments as new information becomes available. Documentation at each stage is crucial for accountability and future reference, ensuring that decisions are defensible and aligned with established protocols. Question 14. Assessment of the most appropriate methodology for evaluating potential risks associated with the introduction of a new interdisciplinary master's program at Akademie Sting, considering the exam's directive to avoid mathematical calculations and focus on conceptual understanding, would involve: Option A. Prioritizing the identification of risks with the highest statistical probability of occurrence, without a detailed consideration of their potential impact on program outcomes. Option B. A focus on identifying risks that can be easily quantified through existing institutional metrics, regardless of their direct relevance to the new program's unique challenges. Option C. An analysis of historical enrollment data from similar programs to identify trends and project future risk levels. Option D. A qualitative assessment that identifies potential risks, evaluates their likelihood and severity in descriptive terms, and prioritizes mitigation based on the nature of the threat. The correct answer is D. A qualitative assessment that identifies potential risks, evaluates their likelihood and severity in descriptive terms, and prioritizes mitigation based on the nature of the threat. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and available information, all while adhering to the specific regulatory framework of the Akademie Sting entrance exam. The core difficulty lies in identifying the most appropriate method for evaluating potential risks associated with a new educational program without resorting to purely quantitative measures, which are explicitly to be avoided. The correct approach involves a qualitative assessment that prioritizes understanding the nature and potential impact of risks, rather than their precise measurement. This aligns with the Akademie Sting entrance exam's emphasis on conceptual understanding and application of principles. Specifically, a qualitative risk assessment focuses on identifying potential hazards, evaluating their likelihood and severity in descriptive terms, and then determining appropriate mitigation strategies. This method is professionally sound because it allows for a nuanced understanding of risks, even when precise data is unavailable, and it directly addresses the exam's requirement to avoid mathematical calculations. It fosters a proactive and strategic approach to risk management, ensuring that potential issues are considered and addressed before they materialize. An incorrect approach that relies on historical data without considering the unique context of the new program fails to acknowledge that past performance is not always indicative of future outcomes, especially for novel initiatives. This overlooks the specific qualitative factors that might influence the success or failure of the new program, such as changes in student demographics, evolving pedagogical approaches, or new regulatory interpretations not captured by historical data. This approach is professionally deficient, as it can lead to an incomplete or inaccurate understanding of the actual risks involved. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on identifying the most probable risks without considering their potential impact is also professionally unsound. While probability is a component of risk, ignoring the severity of potential consequences can lead to misallocation of resources and inadequate mitigation planning. A high probability, low-impact risk might be less concerning than a low-probability, high-impact risk. This approach fails to provide a comprehensive view of the risk landscape. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes risks with the most readily available quantitative data, even if that data is not directly relevant to the core objectives of the new program, is also flawed. This method can lead to a skewed perception of risk, focusing on easily measurable but potentially less significant factors, while neglecting more critical but harder to quantify risks. It demonstrates a lack of critical judgment in selecting relevant risk indicators and can result in a superficial assessment. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to risk assessment that begins with defining the scope and objectives of the assessment. This is followed by identifying potential risks, analyzing their likelihood and impact, qualitatively, as per the exam's constraints, evaluating the overall risk exposure, and then developing and implementing appropriate mitigation strategies. Professionals should always consider the specific context of the situation, the available information, and the regulatory requirements, prioritizing a deep understanding of potential issues over superficial quantitative analysis. Question 15. Which approach would be most appropriate for the Akademie Sting Admissions Committee when assessing potential risks associated with new applicant cohorts, ensuring compliance with internal policies and relevant educational guidelines? Option A. Implementing a comprehensive risk assessment framework that systematically identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks based on objective data and established criteria, with a focus on factors directly relevant to academic performance and institutional fit. Option B. Prioritizing the exclusion of applicants from backgrounds or regions that have historically shown lower average performance metrics without individual assessment to proactively mitigate perceived risks. Option C. Conducting a superficial review of applicant demographics to identify any perceived anomalies without a structured methodology to flag potential concerns for further, less defined scrutiny. Option D. Focusing exclusively on the most extreme hypothetical negative scenarios for any applicant, regardless of probability, to ensure that no potential risk is overlooked. The correct answer is A. Implementing a comprehensive risk assessment framework that systematically identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks based on objective data and established criteria, with a focus on factors directly relevant to academic performance and institutional fit. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need to identify and mitigate potential risks with the imperative to act ethically and within the bounds of the Akademie Sting regulatory framework. The challenge lies in distinguishing between genuine, quantifiable risks and speculative concerns, and in ensuring that any risk assessment process does not lead to discriminatory practices or an undue burden on applicants. Careful judgment is required to ensure the assessment is both effective and fair. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based evaluation of potential risks, focusing on factors that are demonstrably linked to academic success or institutional integrity, as defined by Akademie Sting admissions policies and relevant educational regulations. This approach prioritizes objective criteria and established risk indicators, ensuring that the assessment is fair, transparent, and defensible. It aligns with the ethical principle of treating all applicants equitably and the regulatory requirement to maintain robust and fair admissions processes. An approach that relies on broad generalizations or subjective interpretations of applicant profiles without concrete evidence of risk would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to unfair exclusion of qualified candidates and would likely violate principles of equal opportunity and non-discrimination, which are implicitly or explicitly part of educational regulatory frameworks. Similarly, an approach that focuses solely on the most extreme or unlikely negative outcomes, without considering the probability or impact, would be an inefficient and potentially biased use of resources, deviating from a balanced and proportionate risk assessment. An approach that ignores potential risks altogether would fail to uphold the institution's responsibility to maintain academic standards and a safe learning environment, also representing a regulatory and ethical failure. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the risk assessment, identifying relevant risk categories based on institutional policies and regulatory guidance. This should be followed by gathering and analyzing data using objective criteria, evaluating the likelihood and impact of identified risks, and developing appropriate mitigation strategies. Regular review and validation of the assessment process are crucial to ensure its continued effectiveness and compliance. Question 16. Implementation of a robust risk assessment process for the Akademie Sting entrance exam requires careful consideration of potential conflicts of interest. A senior administrator has identified that one of the exam setters has a close personal relationship with a candidate applying for the same examination cycle. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the Akademie Sting regulatory framework and ethical guidelines for managing this risk? Option A. The administrator should document the identified relationship and initiate a formal review process to determine the extent of the conflict and implement appropriate mitigation measures, such as recusal of the exam setter from any involvement with that specific candidate's assessment. Option B. The administrator should instruct the exam setter to proceed with their duties as usual, assuming that the personal relationship will not influence their professional judgment, and only intervene if a clear breach of conduct is observed. Option C. The administrator should delegate the responsibility of assessing the risk associated with this specific relationship to a junior administrative assistant to ensure a fresh perspective and minimize potential bias from senior staff. Option D. The administrator should have a private conversation with the exam setter, emphasizing the importance of impartiality and trust that the exam setter will act ethically without further formal intervention. The correct answer is A. The administrator should document the identified relationship and initiate a formal review process to determine the extent of the conflict and implement appropriate mitigation measures, such as recusal of the exam setter from any involvement with that specific candidate's assessment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient risk assessment with the imperative to adhere to the Akademie Sting specific regulatory framework and ethical guidelines. The challenge lies in identifying potential conflicts of interest and ensuring that the risk assessment process remains objective and unbiased, thereby safeguarding the integrity of the entrance examination. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating potential risks to the integrity of the entrance examination, with a specific focus on conflicts of interest. This approach is professionally sound because it aligns with the Akademie Sting commitment to fair and transparent admissions, as mandated by its internal regulations and the overarching principles of academic integrity. By proactively identifying and mitigating risks, such as those arising from personal relationships, the institution upholds its ethical duty to all applicants and maintains public trust. An incorrect approach that relies solely on informal discussions and personal assurances fails to establish a documented audit trail and lacks the rigor required by regulatory standards. This approach is professionally unacceptable as it bypasses established procedures for risk management and conflict of interest disclosure, potentially leading to undetected biases and a compromised examination process. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness by skipping the detailed risk analysis for known individuals is also professionally unsound. While efficiency is desirable, it must not come at the expense of due diligence. The Akademie Sting framework likely mandates a comprehensive assessment for all potential risks, regardless of familiarity, to ensure consistent application of standards and prevent the overlooking of subtle but significant conflicts. A further incorrect approach that involves delegating the entire risk assessment to a junior staff member without adequate oversight or review is professionally deficient. This approach fails to acknowledge the importance of experienced judgment in risk assessment and the need for accountability. The Akademie Sting regulations would expect that critical processes like risk assessment are handled with appropriate expertise and supervisory checks to ensure accuracy and compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory requirements and ethical principles. This involves systematically identifying potential risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and developing appropriate mitigation strategies. Documentation is crucial at every stage to demonstrate compliance and provide a basis for review and improvement. When faced with potential conflicts of interest, professionals must adhere to established disclosure protocols and recusal procedures, ensuring that decisions are made impartially and in the best interest of the institution and its stakeholders. Question 17. The audit findings indicate potential material misstatements in the revenue recognition process due to aggressive accounting policies. These findings are based on preliminary analysis and require further investigation and discussion with management. Which of the following is the most appropriate next step for the audit team? Option A. Continue the audit without further discussion of these findings until the final audit report is completed. Option B. Immediately inform the company's external auditors and regulatory bodies of the potential misstatements. Option C. Present the preliminary findings to the Chief Financial Officer and the Audit Committee, emphasizing their preliminary nature and seeking management's input for further investigation. Option D. Publicly disclose the potential misstatements to the market to ensure transparency. The correct answer is B. Immediately inform the company's external auditors and regulatory bodies of the potential misstatements. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for timely and accurate financial reporting with the potential for misinterpretation or misuse of preliminary audit findings. The audit team has identified issues that, while not yet finalized, could significantly impact the perceived financial health of the company. The pressure to communicate these findings internally, especially to management and the board, is high, but the risk of premature disclosure or misrepresentation is also substantial. Careful judgment is required to ensure that information is shared appropriately and responsibly. The correct approach involves a structured and controlled communication process that prioritizes verification and context. This means that the audit team should present their findings to the appropriate management personnel, such as the Chief Financial Officer or Audit Committee, in a clear and documented manner. The communication should emphasize that these are preliminary findings, subject to further discussion, clarification, and finalization. This allows management to understand the potential issues, provide their perspective, and collaborate on remediation plans before the audit is concluded. This aligns with professional auditing standards that mandate clear communication of significant findings to those charged with governance and management, while also respecting the iterative nature of the audit process. An incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate these preliminary findings to external stakeholders, such as investors or the public, without proper verification or context. This would violate professional ethical obligations related to confidentiality and accuracy. It could also lead to market panic or damage the company's reputation based on incomplete information. Another incorrect approach would be to withhold the findings entirely from management until the final audit report is issued. This would be a failure to communicate significant issues in a timely manner, hindering management's ability to address them proactively and potentially breaching professional responsibilities to inform those charged with governance. Finally, presenting the findings as definitive conclusions without acknowledging their preliminary nature would be misleading and unprofessional, undermining the integrity of the audit process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the stakeholders and the nature of the information. Next, they should assess the materiality and certainty of the findings. The communication strategy should then be developed, considering the appropriate audience, timing, and level of detail, always prioritizing accuracy, objectivity, and compliance with professional standards and ethical guidelines. This involves seeking clarification, discussing potential impacts with management, and ensuring that any disclosures are properly contextualized and verified. Question 18. During the evaluation of a new applicant's suitability for a specialized academic program at Akademie Sting, a risk assessment is being conducted. The assessment aims to identify potential challenges the applicant might face in completing the program successfully. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for a comprehensive risk assessment with the ethical and regulatory obligations of the Akademie? Option A. Clearly defining the specific areas of risk relevant to program success, identifying the minimum necessary information to assess these risks, and seeking explicit consent for the collection and use of any personal data required. Option B. Relying on informal conversations and general impressions of the applicant's demeanor during the initial interview to gauge their suitability and potential risks. Option C. Requesting a broad range of personal and academic documents from the applicant, including sensitive medical history and financial records, to ensure no potential risk factor is overlooked. Option D. Focusing the risk assessment solely on publicly available information and the applicant's stated academic goals, without requesting any further personal details. The correct answer is C. Requesting a broad range of personal and academic documents from the applicant, including sensitive medical history and financial records, to ensure no potential risk factor is overlooked. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need to gather comprehensive information for a risk assessment with the obligation to respect client confidentiality and data privacy, as mandated by the Akademie Sting internal guidelines and relevant data protection principles. A superficial risk assessment could lead to misinformed decisions, while an overly intrusive one could breach trust and regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a structured and proportionate information gathering process. This means identifying the specific risks to be assessed, determining the minimum necessary information to evaluate those risks, and obtaining explicit consent for data collection where appropriate. This aligns with the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that data is collected only for the stated purpose of the risk assessment and is not excessive. Adhering to these principles is crucial for maintaining client trust and complying with the Akademie's ethical framework, which emphasizes responsible data handling. An approach that involves broadly requesting all available client information without a clear, specific purpose for each piece of data is incorrect. This violates the principle of data minimization and could lead to the collection of irrelevant or sensitive information that is not necessary for the risk assessment, potentially breaching confidentiality and data protection guidelines. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the risk assessment based on assumptions or incomplete information due to a reluctance to ask for necessary details. This compromises the integrity and accuracy of the risk assessment, potentially leading to inadequate risk mitigation strategies and failing to meet the Akademie standards for thoroughness. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear definition of the risk assessment objectives, followed by a systematic identification of the data required to achieve those objectives. Professionals must then consider the most ethical and compliant methods for obtaining this data, including seeking consent and ensuring data minimization. If there is any doubt about the necessity or proportionality of data collection, seeking guidance from a supervisor or the Akademie's compliance department is the appropriate course of action. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows a preliminary identification of potential risks to the Akademie Sting entrance exam's integrity. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates a comprehensive and compliant risk assessment strategy for this context? Option A. Prioritizing risks based on their potential impact on the exam's fairness and validity, supported by a documented analysis of likelihood, and allocating mitigation resources accordingly. Option B. Deferring the assessment of certain risks until they manifest, based on the assumption that proactive mitigation for all potential issues is impractical. Option C. Focusing mitigation efforts on risks that are most frequently discussed by exam administrators, regardless of their assessed likelihood or impact. Option D. Documenting all identified risks with equal weight, without a clear prioritization mechanism, to ensure no potential issue is overlooked. The correct answer is A. Prioritizing risks based on their potential impact on the exam's fairness and validity, supported by a documented analysis of likelihood, and allocating mitigation resources accordingly. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, all while adhering to the specific regulatory framework of the Akademie Sting entrance exam. The examiner must demonstrate a nuanced understanding of risk, moving beyond superficial identification to a deeper analysis of potential impact and likelihood within the context of the exam's objectives. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process that prioritizes risks based on their potential to undermine the exam's validity and fairness, aligning with the Akademie STING commitment to rigorous and equitable assessment. This methodology ensures that resources are allocated effectively to mitigate the most significant threats, thereby safeguarding the integrity of the entrance process. Regulatory compliance is achieved by demonstrating a clear, defensible rationale for risk prioritization, which is a fundamental expectation in any standardized assessment process governed by institutional guidelines. An approach that focuses solely on easily identifiable risks without considering their potential impact or likelihood fails to meet the depth required by a robust risk assessment framework. This oversight can lead to misallocation of resources, leaving more critical vulnerabilities unaddressed. Another incorrect approach, which relies on anecdotal evidence or personal intuition rather than a structured evaluation, lacks the objectivity and transparency necessary for a defensible risk assessment. Such methods are inherently subjective and cannot be consistently applied or audited, violating principles of good governance and fair assessment. Finally, an approach that ignores potential risks due to a lack of immediate evidence, without establishing a mechanism for ongoing monitoring, demonstrates a failure to proactively manage threats and can lead to unforeseen disruptions or compromises to the exam's integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the risk assessment. This is followed by systematic risk identification, considering all potential internal and external factors. Crucially, each identified risk must be analyzed for its likelihood of occurrence and potential impact. Risks are then prioritized based on this analysis, allowing for the development of appropriate mitigation strategies. Finally, the entire process should be documented and subject to regular review and updates to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness. Question 20. Performance analysis shows that a significant number of applicants for the Akademie STING entrance exam have previously encountered issues with academic integrity in their prior educational institutions. To proactively manage this risk, which of the following approaches to risk assessment would be most appropriate for the STING admissions committee? Option A. Prioritize identifying and mitigating only those integrity risks that have occurred most frequently in the past, assuming that less frequent risks are less critical. Option B. Focus solely on historical data of past integrity violations to disqualify applicants with any prior infractions, regardless of the nature or recency of the incident. Option C. Develop a comprehensive risk assessment framework that identifies potential integrity breaches, analyzes their likelihood and potential impact on the STING program, and outlines mitigation strategies for the admissions process. Option D. Rely on the subjective judgment of individual admissions officers to flag applicants they perceive as potentially having integrity issues, without a standardized process. Correct answer is C. Develop a comprehensive risk assessment framework that identifies potential integrity breaches, analyzes their likelihood and potential impact on the STING program, and outlines mitigation strategies for the admissions process. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practical constraints of a university entrance exam environment. The Akademie STING entrance exam, as a regulatory framework, mandates a thorough understanding of risk assessment principles. The challenge lies in designing a question that tests this understanding conceptually, without resorting to complex calculations, while ensuring it aligns with the specific learning objectives and assessment standards of the STING entrance exam. The correct approach involves identifying the fundamental principles of risk assessment and applying them to a plausible, albeit simplified, scenario relevant to the academic or administrative context of a university. This approach is right because it directly tests the candidate's ability to conceptualize risk identification, analysis, and evaluation, which are core components of risk management as likely outlined in the STING entrance exam's curriculum. Regulatory justification stems from the exam's presumed objective to assess candidates' foundational knowledge in areas critical to academic and administrative integrity, including the proactive identification and management of potential issues. Ethically, it promotes a responsible and forward-thinking mindset. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data without considering future implications fails to grasp the forward-looking nature of risk assessment. This is ethically problematic as it suggests a reactive rather than proactive stance, potentially leading to unforeseen problems. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the most probable risks, ignoring low probability but high impact events, demonstrates a flawed understanding of comprehensive risk management. This is a regulatory failure as it deviates from the principle of considering the full spectrum of potential risks, which is essential for effective governance and operational resilience as expected by the STING framework. An approach that solely relies on subjective opinions without any structured analysis lacks the rigor required for a professional risk assessment. This is both a regulatory and ethical failure, as it undermines the objectivity and systematic nature of risk assessment processes, leading to unreliable and potentially biased outcomes. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first understanding the specific context and objectives. They should then employ a structured methodology that includes identifying potential risks, analyzing their likelihood and impact, evaluating their significance, and determining appropriate responses. This systematic process, grounded in established principles and any relevant institutional guidelines, ensures that risks are managed effectively and that decisions are informed and defensible.